In part 1 of this video series, we discussed how to build this jig for making accurate 60-degree cuts on the table saw. A link to that video can be found in the description below. During this video, we will discuss how to make this 3D effect out of wood. It will require making lots of trilateral trapezoids out of 3 different shades of wood. I'm using maple, cherry, and Peruvian walnut. Please be safe when using power tools, and follow these wise words of wisdom from my woodworking hero, Norm Abram. Before we can use the jig, we will need to make wooden strips out of each type of wood that are of equal height. The length will depend on the final common height. In this case, the pieces were 0.753 inches tall and at least 2 inches long. This is a little longer than the final length of the trapezoids. Now, let's talk about the math that determines the length once you know the common height of the wood. In a trilateral trapezoid, 3 of the sides have the same dimension. Let's call it x. This dimension represents the common height. Our goal is to use the height dimension to calculate the length. These angles have to be 60 because 6 of them make up a full revolution. If we draw in this segment, which has the same dimension as the height, we get a perfect 30, 60, 90 triangle. In a 30, 60, 90 triangle, the length across from the 30-degree angle is always equal to the length across from the 60-degree angle divided by the square root of 3. So in this case, the length across from 30 is the height divided by the square root of 3. The same argument can be made about this triangle on the left. Another fact about the 30, 60, 90 triangle is that the side across from the 90-degree angle is always 2 times the side across from the 30-degree angle. So in this case, this length will be 2 times the height divided by the square root of 3. Since this dimension is also x, it will also be 2 times the height divided by the square root of 3. Finally, to get the total length across the bottom, we will need to add up these 3 quantities, which results in the following formula. This formula will be used to calculate the length given a common height. This is the distance that the stop needs to be away from the blade in order to create a trilateral trapezoid. So the desired length will always be 4 times the height that you've milled your stock to divided by the square root of 3. Since the wood I milled has a height of 0.753 inches, the length of the longer base will need to be 1.739 based off of this formula. And that's where I'll set the stop on the jig. This is also how I chose 2 inches for the length of the milled stock. Before setting the fence on the jig, first use the jig to cut a 60-degree angle on one side of each of the milled pieces. Make sure the common height dimension is always face down on the jig. Be sure to be wearing protective gear because these little pieces had the tendency to fly off. Next, I will set the stop to the length that we calculated earlier. At the beginning, I just get close with a ruler. It seemed easier to start a little under the dimension and work up than it did the other way. After the initial test cut, I use my calipers to see what the length is so I can adjust accordingly. Sorry, my camera didn't focus on this dimension, but it was short by a lot relatively speaking, so I just adjusted it by hand and cut another test piece. This second test piece was short by about 2/100ths of an inch. To adjust the stop, I searched the house for something that had this thickness and ended up finding a post-it note that worked. So to make this adjustment, I clamp an old test piece in the jig before moving the stop. Then I loosen the stop and insert a sliver of the Post-it note between the stop and the clamped test piece. Finally, I move the stop up against the Post-it note and tighten the knob. I have since made a major upgrade from the Post-it note to this automotive feeler gauge as the method for fine-tuning the stop. As you can see, we reached our desired length. Measuring this length can be a bit tricky. What I found works best is to place the trapezoid on a flat surface and position the calipers so that the smaller base of the trapezoid is in complete contact with the calipers. Now that the stop is set at the right distance, I used a jig to put a second 60-degree angle on the pieces from earlier. You should end up with lots of trilateral trapezoids when finished. To make final glue up easier, I took a cherry, a maple, and a walnut trapezoid and glued them together to form a triangle. I used a rubber band to hold the pieces together while the glue dried. Be sure that the joints are tight and the sides are flush. You will need to make two different types of triangles in order to achieve the 3D effect. The first type has maple horizontal at the bottom right with cherry slanted on the left, and the second type has maple horizontal on the bottom left with walnut slanted on the right. With the help of a different jig, lay out the triangles with a few extra pieces so that all the pressure points form a rectangle. These are the type 1 triangles, and these are the type 2 triangles. Finally, glue up and clamp the pieces together. You might need to do some minor filling with epoxy or wood glue and sawdust. But if a little extra time is spent in all the measuring, the filling should be minimal or non-existent. Thanks for watching. You can follow me on Instagram at woodworking_for_fun.